When we hear history, we usually picture wars, kings, revolutions, and famous speeches. But underneath almost every big historical moment, there's an economic story. Because economies aren't just about money. They're about food, jobs, resources, trade routes, taxes, debt, and who controls what people need to survive. So today we're doing something different. We're going to travel through history, ancient to modern, using one lens: how economies rose, collapsed, and reshaped the world. And here's the twist. A lot of the economic problems we talk about today, inequality, inflation, supply shocks, debt crises, have ancient versions. The names changed, the tools got more advanced, but the pressure points stayed surprisingly similar. So let's start at the beginning, before banks, before stock markets, back when wealth was measured in grain and land. Part 1. Ancient economies: grain, land, and power. In the earliest civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the economy was basically a giant survival system. If you controlled water, you controlled agriculture. If you controlled agriculture, you controlled people. Think of the first economic policies as simple questions. Who owns the land? Who stores the grain? Who gets fed during a bad harvest? In ancient Egypt, the Nile flooded predictably. That meant steady crops, and steady crops meant the state could collect taxes, often paid in grain. That grain wasn't just food. It was savings. It was insurance. It was a form of power. And in Mesopotamia, early temples and palaces weren't just religious or political centers. They were economic headquarters. They stored goods, tracked debts, organized labor, and managed trade. This is also where we get one of the oldest economic ideas in human history: debt. Yes, debt is ancient. Farmers might borrow seed grain, promising to repay after harvest. If harvest failed, debt didn't disappear. It accumulated. And that's where social tension began. Because if too many farmers fell into debt, they could lose land, become servants, and destabilize the whole society. Some ancient rulers responded with something that sounds shockingly modern: debt forgiveness, sometimes called debt jubilees. Not because they were being generous, but because a society full of desperate debtors is a society close to revolt. So even in the ancient world, leaders learned a lesson. Economic stability is political stability. Now, let's jump forward to a civilization that perfected the art of turning economics into empire: Rome. Part 2. Rome. The economy of an empire. Rome didn't just conquer land. Rome built an economic machine. At its peak, the Roman Empire connected Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East through roads, ports, and trade routes. Grain from Egypt fed the city of Rome. Olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, spices and silk from far beyond the empire moved through Roman networks. But empires have a hidden economic problem. They're expensive. Armies cost money, fortifications cost money, bureaucracies cost money. And when conquest slows down, new loot stops flowing in. Rome relied heavily on taxation, especially from provinces. But taxes can only stretch so far before they break people. Then comes another classic economic issue: currency debasement. Imagine you have coins made of silver, but the state needs more money to pay soldiers. So they start minting coins with less silver and more cheap metal. The coin looks the same, but it's worth less. Over time, prices rise. Trust falls. Trade becomes harder, and the economy starts to wobble. Rome didn't fall because of one reason, but economic strain, rising costs, unstable currency, heavy taxes made the empire fragile. Here's the big historical takeaway. When a government weakens the value of its money, people eventually change their behavior. They hoard real goods. They avoid taxes. They trade less. And the system becomes harder to hold together. Now let's move into a period people call the Dark Ages. But economically, it wasn't just darkness. It was a major reset. Part 3. The Medieval Reset. Feudalism and Local Economies. After Rome's networks weakened, long-distance trade shrank. Security dropped. Travel got riskier. So economies became more local. That's where feudalism comes in. Land became the main source of wealth. Power was tied to who owned land and who controlled labor on it. Most people were peasants. They worked fields, paid rents or taxes, and in return got protection, at least in theory. But even medieval economies had markets. Towns grew, fairs and trade routes slowly returned. And with trade came a new economic force: merchants. Merchants didn't rely on land the way nobles did. They relied on movement, goods, information, connections. Over time, merchant wealth became a threat to old feudal power. And then, in the 14th century, a disaster hit: the Black Death. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was an economic earthquake. So many people died that labor became scarce. If workers are scarce, their bargaining power rises. Wages go up. Landlords struggle to keep the same control. Some governments tried to cap wages by law. But you can't legislate away supply and demand forever. This period shows something important. Sometimes, a crisis rearranges the economy so deeply that society's entire power structure changes with it. And from these shifting markets and merchant networks, we get the fuel for the next phase, the age of exploration, and a brand new global economy. Part 4. Global Trade and the Price Revolution. When European powers began crossing oceans, Portugal, Spain, later Britain, and the Netherlands, the world economy became truly global. And global economies create new winners and losers. One of the biggest economic shocks came from silver. Spain extracted massive amounts of silver from the Americas. That silver flowed into Europe and then into global trade networks. But here's the catch. If you suddenly increase the supply of money, like silver coins, prices can rise. Europe experienced a long period of inflation, often called the price revolution. Wages didn't always keep up, so ordinary people felt squeezed. Meanwhile, those who owned land or controlled trade often benefited. This is another historical lesson. Inflation isn't just a number. It shifts power. It quietly transfers wealth, sometimes from workers to owners, sometimes from savers to borrowers, depending on how the system is set up. Global trade also created something else: companies. The Dutch and British East India Companies were early corporate giants. They had charters, investors, ships, private armies, and political influence. They weren't just doing business, they were shaping history. So economics and politics fused into something new: capitalism on a global scale. But capitalism didn't emerge smoothly. It came with conflicts, especially around labor. And this sets up the next massive turning point: the Industrial Revolution. Part 5. Industrial Revolution: Machines, Cities, and Inequality. Before industry, most people worked in agriculture or small workshops. Then machines arrived: spinning jennies, steam engines, mechanized looms. Production exploded. But industrial growth came with a human cost. Factories needed workers. So people moved to cities fast, often faster than cities could handle. Housing was crowded. Sanitation was poor. Work days were long. Child labor was common. From an economic view, this period is about productivity. Machines made each worker produce more. That should mean everyone gets richer, right? Not automatically. Because productivity gains can be distributed unevenly. Owners of factories and capital often captured huge profits, while workers fought for wages and safety. That struggle created labor unions, strikes, and political movements. Some demanded reforms, some demanded revolution. This is where modern economic debates begin. How much should markets decide? How much should governments regulate? How do we balance profit with fairness? Now, here's a key point. Industrialization also changed the idea of time. In farming, work followed seasons. In factories, work followed clocks. Time became money, literally. And as factories spread, so did global demand for raw materials, coal, cotton, rubber, metals, which tied industrial economies to colonial systems. So the industrial era didn't just build new wealth, it also intensified global inequality. Next comes the early 20th century, where economies hit a wall, and the world learned what happens when markets collapse. Part 6. The Great Depression. When confidence breaks. The Great Depression wasn't just a bad year, it was a systemic crisis. In the 1920s, many economies grew rapidly. Stock markets boomed, credit expanded. People borrowed to invest. That can work until it doesn't. When markets crashed in 1929, it triggered panic. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. And here's what made it worse. Confidence. Economies run on trust. Trust that money holds value. Trust that banks will give you your deposit. Trust that tomorrow will be stable enough to plan for. When confidence collapses, people stop spending. Businesses stop investing. The economy freezes. Governments faced a question. Do we let the market correct itself, or do we intervene? In the U.S., the New Deal expanded government action. Public works, social safety nets, financial regulation. Different countries responded differently. But the global lesson was clear. A modern economy can spiral downward if institutions fail and policy is too slow. And economic pain can fuel political extremism. That's part of why the 1930s became so dangerous worldwide. Then came World War II. And after it, a new economic order was built. Part 7. Post-war boom in the modern system. After World War II, many countries rebuilt with new rules and institutions. There was a strong push for stability, more regulation of banks, stronger labor protections, and the growth of social welfare programs in many places. Internationally, systems were created to stabilize currencies and support rebuilding. Global trade expanded again, this time with better coordination. In many Western countries, the decades after the war saw rising middle classes. Wages grew, home ownership expanded, education access increased. But no system stays perfect forever. In the 1970s, oil shocks caused sudden price spikes. Inflation rose, growth slowed. This period showed another timeless lesson. When a key input, like energy, gets disrupted, the whole economy feels it. From the 1980s onward, many countries moved toward deregulation, privatization, and globalization. Factories shifted across borders. Supply chains stretched worldwide. Consumers got cheaper goods, but some communities lost stable jobs. So modern debates again return. Efficiency versus resilience. Low prices versus good wages. Global growth versus local stability. And that leads us to a final question. What can history teach us about the economy today? Conclusion: the patterns that repeat. If you zoom out across thousands of years, the economy keeps returning to a few repeating patterns. 1. Control of essentials creates power. In ancient times, it was grain and water. Today it might be energy, chips, data, housing. 2. Money depends on trust. Debased coins, bank runs, market panics. They all show how fragile confidence can be. 3. Shocks reshape society. Plagues change labor markets. New trade routes shift empires. Energy crises rewrite policy. And 4. Growth doesn't automatically mean fairness. Every era faces the same question. Who benefits from progress, and who gets left behind? So when you hear modern headlines about inflation, housing costs, job disruptions, trade conflicts, remember, these aren't brand new stories. They're new chapters of an old human pattern. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes. If you want, I can also write a second script focused on one era, like Rome's inflation, the Great Depression, or the rise of global trade. With more detail and examples for visuals and storytelling,